Yellow. Do you believe in rebirth? Well, maybe these hieroglyphs here will help you decide. This picture here is from a papyrus scroll. And when I enlarged it to this size, it didn't come out very clear, so I had to redraw it. I also added colors. Now the colors don't change the meaning, but they do help to explain it. These papyrus scrolls were put in the tomb of the dead to preserve this divine science for future generations. They were the ancient Bibles of the Egyptians. This yellow disc here represents the sun. This dark disc here at the bottom represents the sun in the underworld. The Egyptians called it Amente. It's non-earth consciousness, similar to sleep. And this up here is the resurrected sun. Now, these two dotted circles here represents there are two suns, the Son of Man and the Son of God. Therefore, there are two mothers, human and divine. First, let's go to the human mother. She's a physical person. This sign that she's holding here in her hands represents, well, just a minute now. What that means is grasp the power of the fourth and fifth kingdom, human and divine, over your egg and blood. Now, her skirt here represents her set, subjective spirit, controls her body's reproductive powers. Now this diagonal strap here represents, it is biased, body and mind. And this sign right here represents she's the mother of the Son of Man. Now, this sign up here represents the two powers of life of the mind over her reproductive powers. Now this sign right here, see the phallic symbol here? That's the father principle. That's also a physical person. The first leg here represents the first step, understanding the law of the fourth kingdom, human. This next leg represents the next step, practicing genetics. That's the principle of life. Now this sign is repeated 4 times. Excuse me. Representing there are 4 essential elements to human genetics. 1, you have to be virile. 2, you have to desire to practice this type of genetics. 3, you have to cultivate the right spirit of mind and body. 4th, you have to do the right things. Now let's go to this side over here. This is the Divine Mother, 2 principles. She holds the same sign in her hands, representing grasp the power of the fourth and fifth kingdom, human and divine, over your egg and blood. Now, the egg and the blood here is different than over here. The egg and the blood over here is physical. Here, the egg represents your genetic potential, and the blood, your body's vital force. And her skirt here represents man's set subjective spirit, which controls his body's blood and the body's genetic potential or reproductive powers. Now this strap right here, diagonal, represents her man's subjective spirit or anima is biased, body and mind. Now you see this sign here? It's the same sign as over here, which means the biased carnal mother spirit and the biased divine mother spirit are both right. This is a right angle. Now this sign here represents she's the mother of the Son of God, or divine. And this sign up here represents the two powers of life of mind over her body's reproductive powers. Now this sign here, see the phallic symbol here? That's the father principle again. But it's not the same as over here. This is man's outer conscious self, or animus. This leg represents first understanding the law of the fifth kingdom, or divine, and the next step, practicing genetics. That's the principle of life. Now this sign is repeated 4 times, representing the 4 essential elements of divine genetics. 1, you have to be virile. 2, you have to desire to practice this type of genetics. And 3, you have to cultivate the right spirit of mind and body. And 4, you have to do the right things. Now, if any one of these essential elements is missing, the resurrection of the Son does not occur. Now, this resurrection of the Son here from death works both ways. Life eventually ends in death from natural or man-made causes. That's inexorable. And the Son descends back into the underworld. Excuse me. And however, the rebirth of the Son here is not automatic. It requires human genetics. Now, there are 9 dotted lines here, representing 9 powers of rebirth of the Son. The first is willpower. Without that, nothing happens. The second is the duad. In Egyptian hieroglyphics, there are many duads. But this is the basic one, the negative and positive principle. In other words, you're not forced to practice these type of genetics. You can say yes or no, carnal or divine. Now the third principle is the triad. The fourth, the tetrad. The fifth, the pentad. Now the pentad are the guidance of the 5 senses when you're practicing these types of genetics. Now the 6th is the hexad, And the seventh is the heptad. Now that is the seventh sense, conscience, which tells you what is right and wrong when you're practicing this type, genetics of this type. Now what is right and wrong here is different to what is right and wrong here, because these are two different types of sciences. Now the eighth principle here is the octuad. That's 4 powers human and 4 powers divine. They're also called the primordial octuad because these powers have existed since the origin of man. Now the ninth principle here is time is required for the rebirth of the sun. This is the rebirth of the sun by your egg and your blood going into this process, so your genetic potential here and your body's vital force into the resurrection of the sun. This is the gestation period. Time is required. Now you see this sign up here? That's the birth of the sun on earth by these powers. See these dots here? By these powers. Now this U here represents that sun can be you, or your son, or the divine son. Now I'm going to go to the smaller hieroglyphs. This sign white, triple sign white here represents our 3 stages to the sunrise. 1, 2, 3. This sign here represents the written meaning or interpretation of hieroglyphics. The 4 principles of the sun: male, female, carnal, and divine. That's the written interpretation. The principle of your 4 powers of genetics: 2 subconscious, 2 conscious. And the principle of your tri-powers of genetics: father, mother, and son. The lower and higher power of you, carnal and divine. The knowledge of the lower and higher law. The truth of life, or your egg. Okay, now this group here represents, see this sign right here? You see my hat? That's the conscious mind. It's a symbol of the conscious mind. It means comprehend the carnal potential of your egg. That is the power of the mother, the lower crown of Egypt, speaking of your lower and higher power of life. Now this group, comprehend the divine potential of your egg. That is the power of the mother, the lower crown of Egypt, speaking of your 2 powers of genetics. Now I have explained the meaning of these hieroglyphs. Now it's up to you to determine whether you believe this universal principle of the sun's rebirth, the 2 suns, the 2 mothers, and these powers. I'm finished.